Her husband boasted that his wife ran his store until the ledger was opened before the whole town. When Thomas Whitcomb laughed at the church supper and told half the town that his wife could run his store, pay his debts, keep his house, and still have his coffee hot before breakfast, Nora Whitcomb did not answer him. She only looked down at her hands. They were plain hands, narrow, dry from lye soap, with a little ink gathered beside the nail of her middle finger. They had counted nails by the keg, measured lamp oil by the gallon, folded invoices from the railway office, washed linen, mended collars, and held her daughter through fever. For 14 years, those hands had done the work that Thomas called good fortune. By the next morning, the town would learn what those hands had also been doing in silence. They had bought back the store, note by note. They had saved the Whitcomb name from disgrace. And they had kept, under a stack of table linen in the dining room sideboard, a green ledger with a brass clasp, and every proof Thomas had been foolish enough to boast about. The supper was held in the basement of the Methodist Church in Milford Junction, Ohio, in the autumn of 1898. The room smelled of coffee, wet wool, paraffin, and chicken pie. Women from the Ladies' Aid had been working since noon, setting out long boards on trestles and covering them with white cloths that had been washed thin from use. The men stood near the stove and spoke of rail shipments, corn prices, and the new electric lights that Columbus was bragging about. Nora had spent the afternoon at Whitcomb Hardware and Feed, closing the books for September before she crossed the square to help with the supper. She had swept the front boards, locked the cash drawer, answered a telegram from the Cincinnati supplier, and written 3 receipts in the careful hand that the bank cashier had once called better than any clerk's in the county. Then she had gone home, changed her collar, pinned her dark hair into a firm knot, and brought 2 apple cakes to the church under a clean towel. Thomas arrived late. He always did, when lateness could look like importance. He came in with his gray suit brushed too sharply for a working day, his watch chain bright across his waistcoat, and a cigar smell clinging to him, though he had not earned the money for cigars in years. His mother, Mrs. Abigail Whitcomb, walked beside him in black silk and lace gloves. She had been a widow for 12 years and a judge of everyone for longer than that. People moved a little when Abigail entered, not because they loved her, but because the Whitcomb family had once owned half the commercial block and still knew how to make poverty look like a moral failing. Nora saw them from the serving table. Thomas lifted his chin at her as if she were a hired girl whose name he happened to know. Mrs. Whitcomb let her eyes pass over Nora's apron. It was clean. Nora had made sure of that. But it was still an apron, and Abigail had never forgiven Nora for being useful in public. Nora had married into the Whitcomb family when she was 21, the daughter of Sarah Donnelly, who kept a boarding house near the depot and took in railroad men who paid late, if they paid at all. Sarah had been Irish by birth, American by labor, and respectable only when people needed her beds. She could stretch a soup bone through 3 meals and make a room ready for a stranger in 10 minutes. She had also trusted a husband who drank through her savings and signed away the boarding house while she was nursing a fever. Nora had been 12 when she and her mother carried 2 trunks into a rented back room over a harness shop. That night, Sarah spread receipts across the table and searched for one paper that would prove what every neighbor already knew, that she had paid for the house with work no one had counted. The paper was gone. The house was gone. By winter, Sarah was coughing blood into handkerchiefs and saying that a woman should never let her life depend on a man's memory. Nora remembered the sound of those receipts more than her mother's face. The paper had rasped softly under Sarah's fingers, like dry leaves being turned over after frost. Since then, Nora had kept every paper, every invoice, every note, every bank receipt, every penciled promise. At first, Thomas had admired that. In their early years, when Whitcomb Hardware still smelled of new pine shelves and Thomas still came down before opening, he used to say that Nora had a head for figures. He said it with warmth then, or something close to warmth. He would lean on the counter and watch her total a column faster than he could light a match. In those days, he had broad shoulders from lifting feed sacks and a laugh that made Ruth, when she was a baby, clap her hands. But work had left him little by little. Not in one calamity. That would have been easier to name. It left him as fog leaves a field. First, he stopped unloading wagons because his back troubled him. Then he stopped visiting farms because farmers liked Nora's prices better. Then he stopped reading supplier letters because Nora understood freight rates. After the panic of 1893, when the bank threatened the store and half the town was counting coins in kitchen drawers, Thomas took to sitting in the front window with the newspaper while Nora negotiated extensions with Mr. Elias Pritchard at the bank. By 1898, everyone in Milford Junction knew where to go if they wanted the true price of seed, coal, hinges, lamp chimneys, or credit. They went to Nora. They still called the shop Whitcomb Hardware. Thomas made sure of that. At the church supper, Nora moved between tables with a coffee pot. Ruth, 13 years old and long-limbed, helped stack plates near the stairs. She had Nora's gray eyes and Thomas's stubborn mouth. Nora had hoped to send her home early, but Ruth wanted to hear the singing after supper, and Nora had not had the heart to refuse. Thomas sat near the center table with his mother, Mr. Pritchard from the bank, Reverend Hale, and 2 men from the railway office. It was the sort of table at which every laugh became public property. For the first half hour, the talk was harmless. Corn prices, the station roof, a boy who had run away to Dayton and sent back a picture of himself in a bowler hat. Nora poured coffee and took plates away. Mrs. Whitcomb corrected a young woman about the proper way to fold napkins for a church supper. Thomas praised the apple cake without knowing Nora had made it. Then Mr. Pritchard mentioned the railway account. He said the store had been fortunate to hold the contract after the bad year. He said many merchants would have lost it. Thomas sat back, pleased by the word fortunate. He told them a man had to know how to arrange his household if he meant to have leisure for larger thoughts. He said Nora had a remarkable habit of fussing over ledgers, and since women liked fussing, he allowed her the pleasure. He said she opened the store, paid the bank, handled the railway, ordered the coal, and even remembered when every farmer owed him money. He said all of this as if generosity had made him stand aside. The men smiled at first, not because it was funny, but because men often smiled while deciding whether another man had gone too far. Thomas had wine in him. Not enough to fall, just enough to be honest. He told them Nora paid the notes better than he ever could. He told them he had not read a freight invoice in 4 years. He told them he had a wife who could carry a business and a household without complaint, which proved that a man of judgment need not wear himself out behind a counter. Then he lifted his cup toward Nora, who was standing by the stove with the coffee pot. He said one phrase clearly enough for the table beside him to stop speaking. A clever husband lets his wife do the pulling and still keeps the reins. The words passed through the room slowly. Some women lowered their eyes to their plates. One of the railway men coughed into his napkin. Reverend Hale looked toward the stairs as if the Lord might send an errand requiring his absence. Ruth heard it. Nora knew because her daughter stopped with a stack of saucers in her hands, and one saucer shifted against another with a thin, frightened sound. Mrs. Whitcomb did not look embarrassed. She looked satisfied. For years, Abigail had treated Nora's labor as proof that Nora belonged below the Whitcomb name. If Nora scrubbed, she was common. If Nora kept accounts, she was meddling. If Nora saved money, she was tight. If Nora extended credit to widows or railroad men, she was sentimental with property that was not hers. But if the bank was paid on time, Abigail wore her black silk on Sunday and let people believe the Whitcomb men still had a gift for commerce. Nora walked to the center table and refilled Thomas's cup. Her hand did not shake. Thomas smiled up at her and asked before everyone whether he had lied. It was a small trap. A wife's protest would sound like temper. Her silence would sound like agreement. Nora had lived inside such traps long enough to know their walls by touch. She set the coffee pot down on the table. She said he had not lied. Only that. Mr. Pritchard looked at her then. The bank cashier was a thin man with tired eyes and cuffs, always a little frayed. He had watched Nora come in after closing for 5 years, her account book under one arm and rain on her bonnet, asking for the exact balance on notes Thomas had forgotten existed. He knew what those words cost her. Thomas laughed, triumphant. He explained to the railway men that even his wife admitted it. He said she was built for responsibility while he was built for trust. No one laughed after that. Nora took the coffee pot back to the stove. Ruth came to her side with the saucer still in her hands. The girl whispered only one thing. She asked whether they had to stay. Nora looked at her daughter, at the red mark on her thumb where hot dishwater had caught her earlier, at the way she held her shoulders like a person already learning to become small in public. Nora said they would leave after the hymn. But they did not leave after the hymn, because Mrs. Whitcomb made sure there was one more humiliation to fasten to the evening. When the plates had been cleared and the ladies began selling slices of cake for the hospital fund, Abigail called Nora to the center table. She did it in the tone she used for servants, though Nora had not been a servant in that family for a single hour of her life. She said that since Nora was so capable, she should bring the donation book and write down Thomas's pledge for the new ward at the county hospital. The Whitcomb name, Abigail said, had always been seen where good works were done. Thomas, softened by attention, announced an amount large enough to make Mr. Pritchard's mouth tighten. It was not ruinous. It was worse than ruinous. It was vain. Nora knew the October supplier bill was due in 6 days. She knew the coal shipment had cost more because of the flooded line near Newark. She knew Ruth needed new boots before snow. She also knew that if she objected, Abigail would call her small-minded in a room full of women who bought respectability by the teaspoon. So Nora took the donation book. She wrote the pledge in Thomas's name. Then she wrote the date. Her letters were as neat as prayer. Thomas watched with pride, as if her handwriting were another piece of furniture he owned. At home that night, Milford Junction was already dark, except for the station lamps and a few yellow squares in upstairs windows. A freight train moved through town after 10, slow and heavy, shaking the glass in the Whitcomb dining room cabinets. Nora stood by the sideboard and listened to the plates settle. Thomas had gone to bed without removing his collar. He was asleep before the train cleared the crossing. Mrs. Whitcomb had taken the front guest room. She had complained about the draft, the thickness of the quilt, and the impropriety of Ruth staying up so late. Then she had closed her door with the wounded dignity of a queen forced to sleep indoors. Ruth lingered in the hall. She asked Nora whether Papa meant what he said. Nora could have lied. Mothers often lie out of mercy and call it protection. Sarah Donnelly had lied too in the last winter, saying the cough was nothing and the room over the harness shop would be warmer by Christmas. Nora had loved those lies and hated them later. So she told Ruth that people sometimes say aloud what they have been letting themselves become. Ruth asked whether a wife must allow it. Nora looked toward the sideboard. She said no. After Ruth went upstairs, Nora opened the lower drawer. Under the folded table linen lay the green ledger. It had belonged first to Ezra Whitcomb, Thomas's father. Ezra had been stern, narrow, and fair in the way of men who believe fairness is a column that must total properly. He had never liked Nora's Irish mother, but he had respected clean books. When Nora was newly married and still afraid to touch the store accounts, Ezra had stood beside her at the counter and shown her how to enter credit without pity and debt without cruelty. The ledger's cover was worn smooth at the corners. The brass clasp had a scratch across it from the year a feed hook fell from the shelf. Inside were pages of purchases and payments, but after Ezra died, Nora had begun using the back pages for something else. Proof. She had not planned revenge. At first, she had planned survival. In 1893, when the panic swept through town and the bank called in notes, Thomas said every merchant was threatened and nothing could be done until confidence returned. He sat in the parlor and read newspapers about men in New York as if distant ruin excused local idleness. Nora went to Mr. Pritchard. She took with her the small inheritance Sarah Donnelly had left hidden in a tea tin, money earned one rented bed at a time. It was not much, but it bought the first note at a discount after the bank marked Whitcomb Hardware as doubtful. The note was assigned to Nora's separate name. Mr. Pritchard had looked at her over his spectacles and asked if Thomas knew. Nora had said Thomas knew the store needed saving. After that came another note, then a supplier account, then the mortgage interest on the house, paid from profits Nora had made by keeping the shop open before dawn for farmers and after supper for railwaymen. Each payment went into the ledger. Each receipt went into an envelope tied with blue thread. Each envelope went beneath the linen. By the winter of 1897, Thomas owned the sign over the door, his father's portrait in the office, and his habits. Nora owned the debts he had ignored. There was another paper too. That one had come later, folded inside a letter from a law office in Dayton. Ezra Whitcomb, before his last illness clouded him, had signed a private memorandum. It was not a will, not exactly. It could not hand Nora the store by itself, but it stated, in Ezra's cramped black hand, that if Thomas abandoned the business and Nora preserved it from debt, Thomas was to assign her controlling interest upon settlement of the banknotes. Ezra had written that a name painted on glass was less important than the person who rose early enough to unlock the door. Nora had not seen that paper until 2 years after Ezra's death. Abigail had kept it. Mr. Pritchard found a copy in the bank file when Nora purchased the second note. He had given it to her quietly and said only that some papers have a way of waiting for the person who needs them. Nora had never confronted Abigail. Not then. Not while Thomas could still return to himself. Not while Ruth was little. Not while she could tell herself the next season would be different. But seasons had passed, and that night, after the church supper, Nora opened the ledger to the final pages and read the list by lamplight. Banknote, March 1893. Mortgage interest, June 1893. Coal shipment, October 1894. Railway bond fee, February 1895. Abigail Whitcomb's private account, July 1895. Nora paused there. That line was the one Abigail did not know Nora had found. Or perhaps she knew and had built her cruelty around it. In the summer of 1895, Abigail had pledged family silver and 2 pieces of jewelry to cover a private debt left from Thomas's younger brother, who had died in St. Louis, with cards in his pockets and shame in his wake. If the pledge had become public, the Whitcomb name would have been dragged through every parlor in Milford Junction. Abigail had come to the store after closing, white-faced under her veil, and asked Thomas for money. Thomas was at the billiard room. Nora had paid. She had redeemed the silver, settled the account, and entered the receipt in the ledger without a word. The next Sunday, Abigail wore the redeemed brooch to church and told another woman that Nora's cuffs were too plain for a merchant's wife. Nora had been younger then. The insult had hurt. Now it only clarified the column. She took out the new papers Mr. Pritchard had prepared with Mr. Sloan, the attorney whose office stood beside the courthouse. There was an assignment of Thomas's business interest to Nora in satisfaction of debts paid and notes held. There was a deed transferring the house to Nora's separate estate, because its mortgage had been paid from her separate funds and store profits she had recorded. There was a release for the railway contract, confirming that Nora would continue as responsible manager. None of it would be easy. Thomas had to sign, but Thomas had spent the evening telling the town why he should. Nora placed the papers on the dining table. She sharpened a pencil. Then she wrote a note on a small card from the store counter. She wrote that Thomas should read the green ledger before breakfast. She wrote that Mr. Pritchard and Mr. Sloane would arrive at 9. She wrote one more sentence, then sat looking at it for a long time. "Since you said I keep the reins, I mean to hold them legally." She left the ledger, the card, and the papers on the table where Thomas took his coffee. Then she went upstairs. Sleep did not come quickly. It rarely did. Nora listened to the house breathe around her. Thomas snored in the wide bed. Mrs. Whitcomb coughed once in the front room. Ruth turned over in the narrow room across the hall. Outside, the town settled under the freight smoke and the cold smell of coming rain. Nora thought of her mother in the rented room over the harness shop, turning receipts that proved nothing because no one with power wanted them to prove anything. Then Nora thought of the ledger downstairs. The thought did not make her angry. It made her still. Morning came gray. Rain tapped against the bedroom window. Thomas woke early, as he often did after drinking too much coffee and accepting too much praise. He went downstairs in shirt sleeves and stocking feet, expecting the house to arrange itself around him. Nora remained upstairs long enough to pin her hair. She heard the scrape of a chair, then silence. Then the sharp sound of the ledger clasp being opened. She washed her face, buttoned her cuffs, and went down. Thomas stood at the dining table with the green ledger open before him. The papers lay to one side. The card was in his hand. His face had the flat, pale look of a man who has found a mirror where he expected a window. He asked what she meant by it. Nora said he had read the sentence. He asked if she had lost her senses. She said no, she had recovered them. That was the first direct answer she had given him in months, perhaps years. It seemed to disturb him more than anger would have. He turned pages as if the ledger might become less true if handled quickly. He read dates, amounts, bank stamps, Nora's initials, Mr. Pritchard's signature, his own name attached to debts he had forgotten, debts she had purchased and paid. He stopped at the page with the railway account and swallowed. Thomas had never been a stupid man. That was part of the sorrow of him. A stupid man can be dismissed more cleanly. Thomas understood figures when he had to. He simply preferred a world in which someone else understood them for him. He said a wife could not set traps for her husband. Nora said a husband should not mistake a ledger for a trap simply because it had been kept honestly. Mrs. Whitcomb entered then, wrapped in a black shawl, irritation already prepared. She looked from Thomas to Nora to the papers on the table. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the green ledger. For a moment, something like fear crossed her face. Then pride covered it. She said Nora had forgotten herself. Nora poured coffee into 3 cups. Her hand remained steady. She put 1 cup before Abigail, 1 near Thomas, and kept 1 for herself. Then she sat. It was such a small action that no one else might have understood it. But in the Whitcomb house, Nora rarely sat before serving everyone and clearing something away. To sit while Thomas stood, while Abigail judged, while the papers lay open, was to change the room's grammar. Abigail told her to rise when speaking of family property. Nora looked at her mother-in-law and said the family property was exactly the subject. Thomas slammed his palm on the table. The cups jumped. Coffee spilled into a saucer. Ruth appeared on the stairs in her night wrapper, eyes wide. Nora did not tell her to go back. Some lessons arrive whether mothers invite them or not. Thomas said the store carried his father's name. Nora said the store had carried his father's debts, too, and she had carried those. He said the house belonged to the Whitcombs. She said the bank had not accepted family memory in place of payments. He said she was shaming him in front of his mother and child. Nora looked toward the window where rain made the street shine like pewter. She remembered him at the church supper, lifting his cup while men smiled into their napkins. She told him he had done that work himself. At 9, Mr. Pritchard arrived under a black umbrella, and Mr. Sloane came behind him with a leather case. Their coats smelled of rain and courthouse dust. Mr. Sloane was a square man with a trimmed beard and a way of placing papers down as if each sheet had weight. Thomas said they had no business in his dining room. Mr. Sloane said business was precisely why they had come. The attorney did not raise his voice. That made it worse for Thomas because the room had no argument to hide inside. Mr. Sloane summarized the matter as if before a judge. Nora held assigned notes against Whitcomb Hardware. Nora had paid the mortgage interest and principal from traceable funds. Nora possessed Ezra Whitcomb's signed memorandum and bank copy. The railway contract had been renewed on the condition of her management. If Thomas refused reasonable assignment, Nora could press the notes, and the bank would have no choice but to recognize the holder. No one used the word ruin. It sat at the table anyway. Mrs. Whitcomb's face hardened with every sentence. When Mr. Sloane mentioned Ezra's memorandum, she looked at the ledger again, and Nora knew Abigail remembered the day she hid the original. Ruth sat on the bottom stair, silent as a folded letter. Thomas asked what Nora wanted. The answer had been in her mind for years, but saying it aloud made the room seem larger. She wanted the store assigned to her separate name. She wanted the house deeded to her. She wanted Thomas to keep a modest allowance from the business for 1 year while he decided whether to work for wages, leave for another position, or live with his mother. She wanted Ruth's schooling secured from the store's profits before any adult took $1 for vanity. And she wanted the hospital pledge Thomas had made the night before to be paid, because the town did not need another Whitcomb promise turning hollow in public. Thomas stared at her. The final demand was the one that stung him most. Not the store, not the house. The pledge. Because it proved Nora would not save him by quietly erasing his foolishness. Mrs. Whitcomb said Nora was hard. Nora almost smiled, not from amusement, from recognition. Women like Abigail often called another woman hard when she stopped being absorbent. Mr. Pritchard opened the ledger to the page with the private account from July 1895. He did not read it aloud. He merely turned the book so Abigail could see it. Abigail's hand tightened around her coffee cup. For years she had believed, or pretended to believe, that Nora held no weapon but patience. Now the old woman saw the line that could expose her son's dead brother, her pawned silver, her own begging visit after closing. The room changed around her. Pride did not leave her face, but it thinned. Mr. Pritchard said softly that some names had been protected by Mrs. Whitcomb's discretion. He meant Nora. Abigail understood. Thomas did not. He was still turning pages, searching for a place where the numbers might forgive him. He found none. For half an hour, the rain and the clock spoke more than anyone else. Mr. Sloane explained signatures. Mr. Pritchard explained balances. Thomas argued in bursts, each one weaker than the last. He said he had meant to return to the store. He said Nora had never complained. He said a man could not be expected to know every paper his wife put before him. He said people would laugh. Nora answered only when necessary. She said he had been invited back to the store every season. She said complaint was not the same as evidence. She said he had signed enough papers when profit was involved. And she said people were already laughing, but not at the person he imagined. That quieted him. At last, Mr. Sloane placed the pen beside the assignment. Thomas looked at his mother. For the first time Nora could remember, Abigail had no command ready. The old woman sat with one gloved hand over the ledger page from 1895, as if she could cover the past by touch. Thomas looked at Ruth. The girl did not plead with him. She did not smile. She did not soften herself to make his defeat easier. She looked like a child, watching an adult decide whether truth mattered once it stopped being convenient. Thomas signed. His name, which had always seemed to fill the store window, looked smaller in ink than Nora expected. He signed the assignment. He signed the deed papers for the attorney to record. He signed the railway management release. On the last page, where Mr. Sloane required a brief acknowledgement that the transfer settled debts Nora had paid, Thomas paused. His mouth twisted. He asked whether she meant to make him write that he owed his wife. Nora said no. The ledger had already written it for him. He signed. After the men left, the house seemed to have been emptied of air. Thomas went upstairs. A drawer opened, then shut. Abigail remained at the table. Ruth stood and began collecting the cups, not from habit, but from nervousness. Nora touched her daughter's wrist. She told her to leave them. Ruth stopped. Slowly, she set the cup back down. That was the first victory of the morning that had nothing to do with law. Thomas came down with his hat and coat. He said he would walk to the billiard room. No one reminded him it was raining. At the door, he turned as if he expected Nora to call him back, give him some smaller version of the life he had lost, make his leaving dramatic enough to feel like choice. She did not. He left. Mrs. Whitcomb rose soon after. She moved toward the guest room, then stopped beside the dining table. Her eyes went to the ledger, still open to the private account. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she told Nora that Ezra had been a difficult man. It was not an apology, but it was the first sentence Abigail had ever offered that was not a verdict. Nora closed the ledger. The brass clasp clicked softly. She said many difficult people still manage to be fair. Abigail's mouth trembled once. She looked old suddenly. Not grand, not formidable. Only old, with a widow's black silk hanging from narrow shoulders and a brooch on her breast that Nora had once redeemed from a pawnbroker while Abigail insulted her cuffs. The old woman touched the brooch. She asked whether Thomas knew about St. Louis. Nora said no. Abigail asked whether Nora would tell him. Nora looked toward the door through which Thomas had gone. She thought of all the truths men were spared because women measured the damage before speaking. She thought of Sarah Donnelly, coughing into linen, papers spread uselessly under a lamp. She thought of Ruth on the stairs. She said she would not tell Thomas unless Abigail forced her to. Abigail sat again. The words came slowly then, not as confession, but as a woman pulling furniture away from a door she had blocked for years. Ezra had written the memorandum after watching Nora work through a Christmas week when Thomas had vanished to Cleveland with friends and returned pretending the trip had been for suppliers. Ezra had seen more than he said. He had known his son was charming, weak, and increasingly fond of being admired for work done by others. He had told Abigail the store would not survive Thomas unless Nora had authority. Abigail had argued that the family name could not pass under the hand of Sarah Donnelly's daughter. Ezra had answered that the family name was already under Nora's hand every time she opened the cash drawer. After he died, Abigail hid the paper. She told herself she was protecting Thomas. Then Nora saved the store anyway. Then Nora saved Abigail's own name in the matter of the St. Louis debt. And because gratitude would have required humility, Abigail chose contempt. Nora listened without rescuing her. That was harder than anger. Anger would have given both women something hot to hold. Silence made Abigail carry her own words to the end. At last, Abigail said that she had been wrong about the roof over Nora's head. Nora waited. Abigail said it had been Nora's roof for a long time. Ruth still near the sideboard, drew in a small breath. Nora did not cry. The moment was too clean for tears. Tears would come later, perhaps, when she found one of her mother's old handkerchiefs or saw the house deed recorded. For now, she felt only the strange likeness of a room after a storm has moved past, but before anyone has opened the windows. By noon, the rain stopped. Nora put on her coat and walked to the store with Ruth beside her. The square was muddy, and wagon wheels had cut dark grooves near the pump. Men stood outside the livery stable, glancing toward her and away again. News moved quickly in Milford Junction. It moved faster when it involved property, pride, and a woman who had not behaved as expected. At the hardware store, the sign still read Whitcomb Hardware and Feed in gold letters flaking at the edges. Nora unlocked the front door. The bell above it gave its familiar, tired ring. Inside, the air held the smell of seed, metal, rope, and stove polish. It was not a pretty smell. Nora loved it more than any perfume Abigail had ever worn. Ruth walked to the counter and ran her fingers over the worn place where farmers rested their coins. She had grown up in that store, but had always moved through it like a visitor, a child allowed behind the counter because her mother was too busy to send her away. Nora took the green ledger from her satchel and laid it on the desk in the back office. Ruth asked whether the store was truly theirs now. Nora said the papers still had to be recorded, and the town would have opinions, and Thomas might wake tomorrow full of wounded pride. Then she looked at the shelves, the bins, the ladder, the stove, the order book, and the patch of sunlight breaking through the front window. She said yes. It was theirs. The first customer came before 1. Old Mr. Henley needed lamp wicks and pretended not to know anything. He failed by asking whether Mr. Whitcomb was in. Nora said Mr. Whitcomb was not managing the store that day. Mr. Henley looked at Ruth behind the counter, then at the ledger, then back at Nora. He asked for 6 wicks instead of 4. That was his way of choosing a side. By 3, 2 farm wives had come in for nails and kerosene. A railway clerk brought a freight notice and handed it directly to Nora without hesitation. Mrs. Vale, from the millinery shop, stopped at the door, looked up at the sign and said gold letters were expensive to repaint but sometimes worth it. Nora thanked her. At closing, Thomas appeared across the street. He stood under the awning of the druggist shop, hat low, collar damp from the earlier rain. For a moment, Nora thought he might cross and make a scene. He did not. Ruth saw him too. Neither of them waved. That evening, when Nora and Ruth returned home, Abigail was in the dining room with her travel bag packed. She said she would go back to her own house before supper. Her voice had regained some of its command, but less of its blade. On the table lay the hospital pledge book from the church, open to Thomas's promise. Beside it, Abigail had placed her brooch. She said the pledge should be paid before Sunday. The brooch would cover part of it. Nora looked at the piece. Gold, dark stone, old setting. The same brooch from 1895. The same brooch that had once carried the whole weight of Abigail's pride. For one tempting second, Nora wanted to refuse it. She wanted to say the Whitcomb women could keep their symbols and choke on them. But Ruth was watching. And there are refusals that free only the person speaking, while teaching the next generation nothing but another form of hardness. Nora took the brooch. She said she would enter it properly. Abigail nodded. At the door, the old woman paused. She did not embrace Nora. They were not women made for sudden softness. She only looked at Ruth and told her to learn the books well. Then she left. Weeks passed. The courthouse recorded the deed. Mr. Sloan filed the business assignment. The railway office confirmed the contract in Nora's name. The hospital pledge was paid in full, partly from the brooch and partly from Thomas's allowance, which Nora deducted before he could spend it on performance. People talked. Of course they did. Some said Nora had shamed her husband. Some said Thomas had shamed himself. Some said Ezra Whitcomb must have turned in his grave, though those who remembered Ezra best said he was more likely sitting upright with a pencil, checking Nora's totals. Thomas did not return to the house for 10 days. He stayed first at his mother's, then in a room above the billiard hall, which gave the town more to discuss, and Nora less laundry. When he finally came to the store, it was late afternoon. Ruth was copying figures at the side desk. Nora was weighing seed for Mrs. Henley. Thomas waited until the customer left. He looked tired. Not noble tired, not tragic. Only a man who had discovered that leisure without admiration is merely emptiness. He asked whether there was work. Nora knew Ruth had stopped writing. There were many answers Nora could have given. She could have reminded him of every morning he had slept while she opened the shop, every supper where his plate was filled before hers, every joke that turned her labor into his cleverness. She could have sent him back into the street and enjoyed the clean edge of it. Instead, she looked at the coal dust on the floor near the back room and the shipment that needed stacking before dark. She said there was work at a clerk's wage if he arrived at 7 and took instruction like any other hired man. Thomas flushed. For a moment the old Thomas rose in him, the one who reached for pride the way a thirsty man reaches for water. Then his eyes moved to Ruth, not pleading, measuring. He saw, perhaps, that the child had already learned too much to be fooled by posture. He said he would come in the morning. He did. He was late by 12 minutes the first day. Nora docked him. He was on time the second. No miracle followed. Thomas did not become a saint because a pen had crossed a page. He complained. He tired quickly. He disliked taking orders from Nora in front of farmers who had once called him Mr. Whitcomb with a different tone. Twice he disappeared before closing and lost the afternoon wage. Once he argued over the placement of the coal sacks, and Ruth, without looking up from the order book, corrected the inventory count he had misread. But he came more often than he stayed away. That was not forgiveness. It was arithmetic. Nora had learned to respect arithmetic. Winter settled over Milford Junction. Frost whitened the store windows each morning. The bell over the door grew stiff in the cold. Ruth came before school to help Nora light the stove and copy orders. She took to the figures quickly. Too quickly, Nora sometimes thought with a pang. Childhood should not be counted in columns. But Ruth did not look diminished by it. She looked awake. In December, Nora hired Mrs. Donnelly's old back room over the harness shop for storage. The room had changed little. The wallpaper with blue flowers was faded to gray. The floor dipped near the window. A stain marked the ceiling where snowmelt had once found its way through. Nora stood in the doorway and was 12 again. Ruth came beside her carrying a box of receipt envelopes. She asked if this was the room where Grandmother Sarah had lived. Nora said yes. Ruth looked around with the solemn curiosity of a child touching family history without yet knowing which parts will burn. She asked whether Sarah had kept papers too. Nora crossed to the old table, the same one if memory was not making ghosts of furniture. She laid her hand on the scarred top. She told Ruth that Sarah had kept them, but not enough people had been willing to read them. Ruth set the box down. Then she said they would read Nora's. It was such a simple sentence that Nora had to turn toward the window. Outside, the railway yard lay under dirty snow. A trainman shouted. Steam rose. Life went on with its usual impatience, indifferent to what had been lost in a small rented room. Nora took from her satchel one envelope tied with blue thread. Inside was Sarah Donnelly's last receipt from the boarding house, useless in law, precious in truth. Nora had kept it for 26 years. She placed it in the front of the green ledger, not because it proved ownership, because it proved beginning. On the first Sunday of the new year, the church published the list of hospital donors. Thomas's pledge appeared as paid. So did a new line beneath it. Whitcomb Hardware and Feed, Mrs. Nora Whitcomb, proprietor. The words caused a stir. They were read twice by people who pretended they had not understood the first time. Nora sat with Ruth near the middle pew. Thomas sat 3 rows behind them, beside his mother. Abigail wore no brooch. Her collar looked severe without it. During the final hymn, Nora heard Abigail's voice behind her, thin but steady. After service, people gathered in the vestibule where cold air rushed in each time the door opened. Mrs. Vale squeezed Nora's hand. Mr. Henley said the new wicks were fine quality. Reverend Hale spoke of the hospital fund with the relief of a man glad money had arrived without scandal reaching the newspaper. Then Abigail approached. The vestibule quieted in the way rooms quiet when old power crosses new fact. Abigail looked at Nora for a long moment. Then she addressed Ruth. She said her grandfather Ezra had always believed a business should pass to the person who kept it honest. It was not the full truth. It was a polished version, suitable for church walls and listening neighbors. But it carried Nora's name safely through the room. Ruth lifted her chin. She said her mother kept it honest. There are sentences that change a room more than shouting. That was one. Thomas looked down at his gloves. Abigail looked at Nora. Something moved between them that was not affection, not yet, and perhaps never. But it was recognition. Late, imperfect, and unable to repay. Still, recognition. Nora accepted it with a nod. That afternoon, she and Ruth walked to the store instead of going straight home. The sky was pale, and the snow along the street had hardened into ridges. Nora unlocked the door and stood inside the quiet shop. The sign painter had come 2 days earlier. The old gold letters were gone. On the window, still smelling faintly of paint, were the new words, Nora Whitcomb Hardware and Feed. Below, in smaller letters, Ruth had insisted on adding, Accounts kept straight. Nora had objected at first. It sounded too plain, too sharp, too much like a private family lesson made public. But Ruth loved it. The sign painter laughed and said plain truth was cheaper than ornament. So Nora let it stay. She lit the lamp, though there was enough afternoon light. Some gestures are not for necessity. The flame caught, trembled, and steadied behind the glass chimney. Ruth went to the desk and opened the green ledger. She dipped the pen carefully, wiped the nib, and wrote the date at the top of a new page. Nora watched her daughter form each number. For years, Nora had imagined dignity as something dramatic. A door slammed, a speech delivered, a husband silenced, a room forced to see. But dignity, she discovered, was quieter than that. It was a deed recorded at the courthouse. It was a daughter who did not leave the room when men argued. It was a mother-in-law who could no longer turn contempt into law. It was coffee poured because one wished to pour it, not because the world would collapse if one did not. It was a ledger closed at night with no fear of what the morning might take. Near dusk, Thomas came to the door. He was early for the next day's work, or late for an apology. Nora could not tell. He stood outside reading the new sign. Snow blew against his coat. For a moment, his face tightened at the painted name. Then he entered. The bell rang. He removed his hat. He asked whether the coal invoice had come. Nora said it had. He asked if she wanted him to stack the back room before morning. She looked at him for a long moment. There was no triumph in it. Triumph would have made him too important. There was only measurement, the way she measured grain, debt, weather, and the distance between a promise and a payment. She said yes. Thomas went to the back room. Ruth bent over the ledger, hiding the smallest smile. Nora moved to the front window and touched the new lettering with 2 fingers. The paint was dry. Her name did not smear. Across the square, the church bell struck 5. A train whistle answered from the east. The town went on. Supper fires were being lit, horses stamped in the cold. Somewhere, women were laying tables, counting coins, folding linen, saving papers no one had yet agreed to honor. Nora thought of them. She thought of Sarah Donnelly. Then she turned from the window, took off her gloves, and sat at the desk beside her daughter. Not at the edge, not ready to rise, not with an apron string caught on a chair or a towel waiting on her shoulder. She sat as if the chair had been made for her. Ruth slid the ledger slightly to the left so they could both see the page. The first line waited. Nora picked up the pen. For once, she did not write a debt. She wrote the day's receipts, the hospital pledge paid, the sign painter's bill settled, and the small wages due to Thomas if he finished the coal before dark. Then, at the bottom of the page, where private notes had always lived, she wrote one sentence for no bank, no attorney, and no man who needed proof before granting respect. She wrote, "The roof is mine because I held it up." After that, she closed the ledger and let Ruth fasten the brass clasp. The click was small, but to Nora, it sounded like a lock opening.